Welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast with Darren Mitchell. If you're a sales leader looking to take your leadership to a whole new level, then this is the podcast for you. We'll be exploring tips, techniques, and strategies to help you take your leadership to the exceptional level and allow you to enjoy more money, more meaning, and better sales results. Welcome back to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast, and welcome to a very special guest coming all the way in from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Although I get a sense from the accent she's not originally from the Sunshine Coast. Glin Bayley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Darren. So lovely to be here.
Glin, I'm going to love this conversation. You are the founder of the Value Negotiator, and we're going to talk about negotiation today from a business-to-business perspective, because given that this audience is predominantly sales leaders and people that are interested in driving value for their customers, negotiation plays a very, very key part in that. So looking forward to delving into this, and I'll preface this by saying that at the end we're going to give people the opportunity to go and get access to your recently, has it been released yet?
It has, just at the beginning of October.
Okay, so a month in. We're recording this as of early November. So the negotiation playbook, and I must say I have read it. I'm going to have to read it again because it's that good. And this is not a shameless plug, but what I love about this book is it's all based on value, and it's all based on generating value. And the interesting thing when we get to business-to-business conversations, most people have to negotiate with people more than once, or organizations more than once. So you better have some good relationships in place, otherwise you won't be doing business for people for very long at all.
Exactly right. Yeah, the world's a very small place, especially now with the impact of the internet, social media. Like what was perhaps 6 degrees of separation, we'd be lucky if it's 2 or 3 degrees now.
Absolutely. And we're just talking just before we press record. We've got a mutual connection out of Canada, Mark Rafan, who's the negotiation ninja. So it is a very small world. So, Mark, if you're listening, kudos to you, mate, to keep up the great work.
Exactly right.
You're a legend. So, Glin, before we jump into the topic of negotiation, I'd love you, just for the listeners, to give a bit of a background in terms of your career so far, and particularly what led you down this path of negotiation, and we'll get specifically into why valued negotiation.
Yeah, I would love to say I had a really fascinating and interesting career as a hostage negotiator, or I was in the police force, or all the things that you read about as to what drove you to be a negotiation trainer in corporate. It's, often there's ex services people that transition their skills in from one field to the other. My transitioning skill set was accountancy, so it wasn't quite the natural assumption that you make that a negotiation trainer and facilitator and consultant is going to have a background as a management accountant. But that's where I cut my teeth in negotiation. I worked for large multinationals, and I worked in predominantly the food and beverage industry. Common to fast-moving consumer goods, you've got low margins, large volumes, and you're dealing with large players, so large branded supplier that I worked part of, and then you worked with the large retailers in the UK. So I was formally trained in negotiation skills when I was first in my finance career, working with sales teams to create deals that we would then be proposing and creating agreements around with the UK retailers. So going on a training program at the time, it was a 4-day residential program with the company I eventually ended up working for. It was brilliant, just the opportunity to put yourself under pressure, to have the opportunity to see how you operated in a negotiation commercial context, be filmed, have those horrid films played back, and you hear your own self speak and you see all of the silly things you do. And it was just a superb experience that at the time shifted a very transactional and combative relationship that I had with my sales team. I was early 20s, had something to prove in finance, and finance are always told, save the business money and stop the sales people giving away margin, all that great stuff. And so, I was just young, and I wanted to show my leaders that I brought value to the business, but often the way I went about creating that value was more a capture, and the conflict and combat happened internally with the sales teams. And so I remember one period standing in the middle of the office having a shouting match with one of my sales colleagues. I'm sure I was called a Rottweiler at some point during my early finance career. But negotiation skills, once you open your eyes to them, they're not just about the deals that you do externally with suppliers or customers. They're as much about the agreements that you make internally with your team, your stakeholders, the different functions within your business. And I think that's what I realized made it so powerful. Where that led me to was transitioning from finance to executive coaching many, many years later. I'd moved from England to Australia in 2015 after my marriage had ended. So at that time, I was very much searching for myself, searching for a new chapter, searching for who I could become, outside of what I thought was, my forever relationship. And in that search, I realized that finance wasn't what lit me up. I was very good at it, but it wasn't something that I felt I had any desire to continue to build mastery in. And I think that's really important in any career path that you choose, that passion and that energy and that excitement is something that you are willing to put in the extra hours, the extra discipline that other people wouldn't do, and something you want to do even if you weren't paid to.
Yeah.
And so what that made me realize is I had a deeper interest in self development, personal growth, and I really wanted to understand what made people hesitate with moving their lives forward and taking big opportunities. So I ended up leaving finance to start an executive coaching business where, through my own journey, I guess from having a very head analytical focused way of thinking to a more philosophical, heart-based approach to thinking, or feeling, I should say, allowed me to say, well, actually, there's merit in both, and I wanted to help leaders take that journey from head to heart to discover who they wanted to be, what they could become, and started down that path. That was brilliant until COVID hit, because I'd only been in my business at the time a couple of years before, and was just about finding my feet, and then COVID closed down the whole world. And I just felt living in Australia away from all of my family, being isolated in my own business as a consultant coach, and then not having a team and no face-to-face work, that it wasn't going to be great for me to continue to try to stay in my business at that time. And so I went back into, I guess, corporate, but not quite corporate. I ended up back in a full-time employed role, but working for the consulting firm that had first trained me in the UK, the best part of 15 years earlier. And that was brilliant because it actually made me realize that had I not left my finance career, had I not done coaching, had I not already started delivering leadership workshops and facilitating training sessions under my own business, I would never have been gifted the opportunity to work for a global organization teaching negotiation skills. So it was I guess a coming together of all of my skill set, and that was brilliant. I started training other people for the first time in negotiation skills, and everything that I had learned and put into practice in my years of corporate commercial experience. And I realized actually what I wanted to do was blend not only commercial negotiation thinking, which is the outer negotiation that everyone has, but I actually wanted to blend the inner negotiation work too. So starting my own business, the Value Negotiator, it's a deeper mission, and I guess a deeper purpose around helping people overcome the inner negotiation with themselves. So to create possibility for who they can become, what they can achieve, the value they can create for their own lives, but translate that into business as well. Because my belief is, unless you do the inner work for yourself, the value you create for your business is also going to be compromised to the extent of your own personal mindset limits.
Yeah.
So doing the inner and outer negotiation is where my deep passion is. And I guess I haven't seen any other organization approach negotiation, commercial negotiation training with such a deeper psychological inner working. The psychology often ends up being the outer psychology of negotiation, but not the inner psychology of what happens with yourself and what
Yeah.
stops you. So
Yeah.
that's the direction I'm taking. The negotiation playbook that I wrote was very much a foundational entry point for me to share some of my insights, but future books will very much focus on the inner and outer negotiation and how you can get business potential unlocked by also unlocking the potential within
Mm.
you, all through a negotiation lens.
Love that because you're right. Just looking at even my own corporate career when it came to negotiations, we did lots of different programs, Scott work negotiations, and all these, really complex negotiation skills. But it was all based on, hey, you got to get this deal done. You got to agree to a compromise and all this sort of stuff. But looking back, none of it was talking about who we needed to be as we were preparing for the negotiation, but also throughout the negotiation. And
Yeah.
it was interesting to watch. And even as I reflect back on the negotiations I've been in, not just training, it's fascinating to watch how people behave. Um, and I think imposter syndrome is spoken a lot about. There's a
Yeah.
lot of that out there as well. I wanted to ask you, in terms of taking that approach, and particularly with the big businesses that you work with today,
Mm.
have you had to sort of lead in with the outward negotiation skills, and then almost by, how do we say this respectfully? Not
Self.
subterfuge, by stealth, to introduce the inner workings? Because I love what you spoke about just before we press record and talking about it. It's who you become along the way, not so much what you do. That's
Yeah,
most important elements. Has that been
100%. Um, I think, yes, from a outside positioning perspective, we're still living at this point in time in a capitalist system.
Yeah.
Whether it works for us or whether it doesn't work for us, it's commercials that people make decisions on, right? So people want to see profit numbers increase, they want to see revenue growth, they want to see return on investment, return on equity, they want to see all of those financial metrics that ultimately drive clarity around their businesses, long-term sustainability and performance.
Mm,
And so that's what they buy. They want people that can negotiate exceptionally to create value for their organization such that their organization stands the test of time.
mm,
And most of that's all financial, measurable metrics, which, given my background in finance, I'm very clear on what CFOs look for and what they measure.
yeah.
However, the bit that most organizations don't realize is it's the inner negotiations that individuals are having with themselves, whether it's imposter, whether it's self-doubt, whether it's their own story about what's possible. Like, if you've got someone with a belief system that getting better than budget is a great deal, you're always going to find someone who stops short of getting an exceptional outcome because they've already saved the business's money based on what the business is measuring.
Mm,
And so I really want to work to your inner workings and go, yeah, like why is getting better than budget where you stop? And it's often where people then hit their comfort. It's like, oh well, I got a saving, I'm now going to look good and a hero in front of my team, my business is going to reward me. Like, why would I step into a space of discomfort to go for extra
mm,
when there's no need to?
yeah.
And that's the piece where's the distinction, and I think businesses miss this, is unless someone's identity is driven to create value because they do it because it's who they are, they will only stop short of like what we need to do. It's like,
Mm,
okay, I've done what I need to do, now move on. Whereas I don't do things just because it's what I need to do. I do it because it's who I am.
yeah.
And who I grow to be and what's possible for me continues to expand and evolve because I've got an identity lens around my inner negotiation and I look at where my inner blocks are. And I think, well, how can I create value if my own sense of worth or perception of my contribution is not accurate
Mm.
or is limiting me? And so
Yeah.
you're right. Yes, people buy the external, and yes, I do the internal more by stealth. And hence why the negotiation playbook is like a little sprinkling of who you can be, with most of it focused on how to negotiate and giving you the practical levers and the steps. But I personally want the potency of my message to increase by combining the two
Mm.
and building from that lens, because I think the exceptional value creators don't just stop at what, they understand who, and they understand themselves.
And through that point, they also know that certainly in a business to business sense, they're more than likely going to be negotiating with the same company or the same people within those companies more than once. So it's not a case of I'm going to win at all costs, because what I'm doing is I'm setting a precedent, and that
Yeah.
almost becomes like the minimum benchmark for the next time. So if you're going really, really hard, because I also wanted to ask you based on your background in the food industry and the retailers and
Mhm.
so forth in terms of some of that, but if we're dealing with cutthroat negotiators, then we're getting treated, or we're getting conditioned on how to treat them. We're also conditioning others on how to treat us. And so I would say that in many cases, you might go into a negotiation not being yourself, because you have to be very protective of what you can get away with and what the other party might be trying to get in terms of a win for them.
Yeah, and that's the common, excuse me, the common perception people have around who am I being. It's like the sense is the old traditional sort of negotiation approaches is I've got to, be someone else or act in a role of X, Y, and Z to get the outcome that I want.
Mm,
But over time, like not only is that not good for your own well-being, because it creates this resistance internally, like, oh, I've got to be someone I'm not to get the outcome I need to get.
yeah.
So it's not sustainable from a human dynamic perspective. Two, you get inconsistent behavior because you're really relying on someone's skill set and will set, if you like, skill set and will set, like how much will do they have to go after something that's tough, and
Yeah.
how much skill do they have? So that's going to be limiting in another way. And three, when I look at the lack of self-awareness that people then have, if they're only focusing on the what and the how to negotiate,
Yeah.
and they're not building that self-awareness of what's actually going on for me, might also be what's going on for the other party. And
Mm,
how can I bring some of my humanness to the table to actually get a better deal? And even if someone's being cutthroat, that doesn't mean me acting against my values. It doesn't mean me acting against my character. It doesn't mean me acting unethically. Like I can be assertive and directive and be very much focused on capturing the maximum value. That doesn't mean you're going to experience me as someone who's rude, obnoxious, and not professional. Like I'm always
mm,
going to be professional. I'm always going to have empathy for you, and I'm going to be agile in the way that I move. But my awareness around what's contextually appropriate will allow me to adapt my behavior to match what's required for the context and the situation without me compromising my sense of self,
yeah.
which I don't think many people know how to do. It's like, oh, I've got to be someone else to get the maximum deal because they're being cutthroat, so I've got to behave like this. And to your point, just a few moments ago, behavior does breed behavior.
Mm,
And I see how quickly someone's triggered when someone's acting cutthroat and tough and aggressive. Let's use the language of aggression versus assertion, which are two distinct ways of approaching it. But I'm like, well, if I'm dealing with someone aggressive, the first thing I need to be able to do is know how to de-escalate that aggression.
yeah.
Because
Yeah.
me matching that aggression and being triggered to behave like them is going to actually harm my sense of character and my value system. So how can I de-escalate? how can I assert my authority so that there's an understanding of power, because people do have different power balances, and some people like power over rather than power with. And I'm in the camp of like, I can still hold my power and not have you feeling like I'm triggering you to elevate your emotional state, because that's not going to get the outcome. But you can't do that if you only address the outside tactical game without understanding actually negotiations are very deep inner negotiation game, like your inner joker, as I call it in the book, or some might call it your monkey mind, your inner chimp that's desperate to get out and go, well, you said this and now we're saying this, and let's get into an argy-bargy around it. But that's not going to create long-term sustainable value, to your point around some of these suppliers are going to be the ones that you're going to be working with for years to come. And you're teaching people how to expect you to operate, which is often, when it's emotionally driven, lacks the professionalism and the self-awareness and the self-regulation to actually get the outcome you want.
Which is very much, I mean, and you think about what good leaders are very emotionally intelligent. They're able to regulate those emotions. They're able, first of all, able to identify those emotions, and anything that's triggered, they're able to deal with them in a most appropriate way.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, before we talk about some of the characters that potentially come out in negotiation, with your background in dealing with retailers, dealing with food organizations, no doubt you would have dealt with not just finance people, but probably procurement people as well.
Yeah.
Um, I love the fact that you're now talking more about we've got to get really good at identifying the inner game and the inner, what we stand for, what's important to us, what potentially triggers us. How challenging was that for you? And was there something that triggered the realization, hey, it's not just about the external? Because my frame of reference and full disclosure, my experience with procurement organizations and some other business to business organizations is they treat it almost like a game, and a game that they want to win. Really tough. You talk about aggressive negotiators. I've dealt with some really aggressive negotiators that give you nothing. And the
Yeah.
expectation is, hey, if you want to do business with us, these are our list of demands. And if you can't tick every one of those off, then I've got somebody who is more than willing to come in and take your place.
Yeah. And that happens, and that will continue to happen because it's the world that we
Mm.
operate in, and people have different levels of emotional intelligence. I was training a procurement team only last week, and one of the case studies that I used was written deliberately to demonstrate how people manage disputes, right? So if you've got an agreement with a supplier and then they don't deliver on the agreement because externally the market shifted, context shifted, there might have been some supply chain issues that are outside of their control.
Mm.
How are we going to reach this agreement? And this is like a year into your partnership, partnership in inverted commas, because
Yeah.
people say the word, but what they say and what they do don't often marry. And I would say it was very evident from the group last week that the default approach is, well, you're in breach of the agreement. What are you going to do about it? And how are you going to repair the fact that you didn't deliver on what we agreed? And it becomes a telling off exercise. It becomes a we told you, this is what we agreed to. You didn't follow through on that commitment. And there's no curiosity, there's no actual, are we aligned on the same objective? So can we first and foremost check that we're still on the line, we have alignment in the way our businesses do business together and what we're trying to achieve. Once we've understood the alignment, okay, let's understand where we might have deviated, and let's understand what may have caused the deviation in the context of, is this going to be a reoccurring future problem? But the danger I see is that with whether it's procurement or sales, I mean, like take procurement and sales as a prime example, right? Like sales often don't want to get procurement involved in certain conversations because they're too hard to deal with. Like they're too hard to deal with. This process, for process sake, there's a here's how we do things. And I'm not saying this is all procurement, because I've worked with some amazing procurement teams, and I've worked with some really challenging sales teams. So like, it's a two-way journey. Like there's good and bad in both camps. But I'm like, your first negotiation is internally within your business. Like,
Mm,
if you don't realize you're sitting on the same side of the table as far as the dollar value of what you create does for your organization, like, you're crazy to not even see you fighting internally is never going to get you a position where you're maximizing value externally. Because there's
mm,
too many areas where you leak value internally, where you're letting your egos, where you're letting different business KPIs, which are created to actually have people working in opposite directions, cost your business far more than, the 5% that the supplier wants you to take off. You pay, or increase on what you pay. So I look at that and go, the inner work isn't just a me at an individual level. It's what are you doing internally in your business? Because your teams are destroying value in the way they're communicating with each other. Forget what's happening outside your organization. So the
it's
inner
so
works both ways,
it's so
internal to an individual and internal to an organization before you can go out.
Absolutely, which means it's so important, and I love you to talk about this in terms of preparation, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of organizations and representatives of organizations that go into a negotiation, perhaps after a request for tender or a tender process, and now we go into the commercials, and they rely on the fact that, hey, we've done the submission, we've done the internal business case, that's the basis now for our negotiations, and we go in from that perspective. And often there are things that the other parties come up with through that negotiation because they've done more preparation. They've probably looked at the next 3, 6, 12 months and maybe 4 or 5 years down the track, depending on the size of the contract. And so the power of doing the preparation before you jump into a negotiation. I mean, it's probably a loaded question, but how important is it to give yourself
Oh, of
option
course
of
it's
getting out?
important. But if we take that tender example, well, tender by nature is a competitive negotiation, right? So the fact that someone's put out a tender is already saying you're in a competitive process. Come on, sales teams, put your best foot forward and tell us, why we should pick you for a shortlist,
Mm,
right? So you're in a competitive process. You often think you're negotiating with your competition because that's what the tender is there to drive you to think, like, oh my God, I'm competing with supplier X and supplier Y, and I'm supplier Z, and therefore how am I going to stay competitive versus them? So you get into your head about, oh my God, how do I look good versus my competitive set? And we think we're negotiating with our competitive set, but we're
mm,
not. We're not negotiating with our competitive set. We're negotiating with the team and the individual that put the tender together. So first of all, understand who you're negotiating with. You're not always negotiating with the person that you think you're negotiating with. Second, to recognize if that's a competitive process, how are you going to ensure value is created? So
mm,
if the tender is the process that people go through, and I had this exact conversation last week, I'm like, well, if you put out a tender and then you're inviting people to pitch, pitching is just another form of selling. That's not
mm,
negotiating. Like, you're not agreeing the terms of a deal. You're not looking at what's valuable to my business, what's valuable to your business. You're just going, here's what I can do for you, and I hope
mm.
what I can do for you meets what your needs are. It's a one-way presentation. It's not a two-way collaboration. So I said,
Yep.
from a procurement perspective, I'd be saying, is the tender the right vehicle for you to extract value beyond the initial shortlist? And I would
Yep.
argue, no, it
Mhm.
won't, because if you've got multi-million-dollar contracts, then multi-million-dollar contracts require multi-year implementation, and multi-year implementation require deep trust-filled relationships. And
Mm,
if you only communicate through a tender platform and you only communicate through email, or the designated reply to the questions, you're not building relationships. So and it's when, not if, shit hits the fan, and let's be frank, it often does,
yep.
because someone's focused so heavily on the getting to the right price that they've missed out on realizing how much cost is involved in the implementation and what
Mm,
level of rigor is required in the implementation. And then things fall over and you spend way more than the initial tender to get things fixed. So I'm like, let's not do that. Let's work on actually getting the right process and the right preparation in place. And from a sales perspective, I'd be not assuming the tender's the only way you can have the opportunity to input. So, often with a tender process, I'm like, give them the answers to their questions, but don't be afraid of submitting something different as an alternative for them to consider that is nothing about what they're asking, but
Yeah.
present them with an innovative solution that they may not otherwise have considered because everyone
Yeah.
else is following the, context of the questions that the procurement team are asking, which are all through their own head and hardly about the other party's interests or capabilities. So preparation allows you to take time to think about where power sits.
Yeah.
It allows you to think about where you've got leverage, whether you've even got the opportunity to present something uniquely different, because if you're lower in power and leverage, you may be at the mercy of going, oh, I've got to just follow the process.
Mm.
But you can't know those things unless you're willing to spend the time to think them through, and I liken it to sports quite a lot, because you wouldn't expect a sports team to go out and go, let's see if we can win the World Cup and get the best outcome for our country without spending, months, if not years, preparing for the game, preparing the skill set of the team, looking at the will of their team, what's going to undermine their mental game if they're in a penalty shootout and there's value to be created under pressure. Because
Yeah.
let's be clear, negotiation is you creating value under pressure.
Yeah.
And the pressure isn't the TV screens with millions of people watching you. It's your business going, how well are you going to deliver under pressure and under these constraints that we've given
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And so that preparation allows you to build that muscle that's needed to play a better game at a different level than most people, because most people will choose to wing it. Most people will come and say, let's see what they come back with. And it blows my mind, because I'm like, if this is what you tell your team, let's see what they come back with, you are significantly underprepared,
Yeah.
because you should know what your response is if they come back with A, B, C, D. If they come back with E, what are we going to do? That's you might think you're one step ahead, but in negotiation, you want to be 5 steps ahead. Because that's how you're playing a better game. And I just don't think enough people take time to slow things down, to really consider where value sits, and then create deals that actually have the other party believing that they've won, in inverted commas, but actually your preparation was so thorough, your priming was so effective, your positioning was so powerful that the other party's given you a deal that you have orchestrated. Only they don't know you've orchestrated it. So that's why I love negotiation. It is a psychological game. It is a game of skill, but it
Yes.
is also a game of the deeper potential to uplift the way humanity communicates with each other, from one that's combative and argumentative and debate filled to one that's collaborative, contribution focused, where you can actually grow the pie and create way more value than you would do if you're just thinking in a siloed.
And that's the thing I love about the way you've approached your book in terms of its value creation, its collaboration. It's not, whilst it might feel as if it's a competitive situation because your customer or a supplier is trying to get the best deal they possibly can. If you do your preparation, if you can look at the bigger picture and you can see perhaps opportunities that are not necessarily written into a document, but you can create something that they've never thought of, they'll have this almost unconscious desire to want to engage with you further, and you probably end up getting a better deal for yourself, but also for them in the process. It's really powerful.
Absolutely. And longer term, everyone knows at a logic level, more value is created when you work with people than against people, right?
Yep.
Like that's baseline logic. However, when egos come into play, which is often the case in negotiations, we forget logic because we're not thinking with our prefrontal cortex. We're not thinking with our executive center. We're in the reptilian part of our brain, which is all about I need to survive. So, me walloping that person with a heavy, hard comment that puts them back in their box is me surviving, but it's
Yeah.
not. It's why choose survival when you can choose to thrive instead?
Yeah.
So I think there's a definite argument for collaboration, but I also want to caveat that and say not everyone is capable of collaborating. So
Yes.
if you go in with a really collaborative approach and you're like, hey, let's work together and let's, create more value, and the other party is playing a competitive strategy and they do not have the will or the skill to create value or collaborate with you, you're in dangerous territory if you've not assessed the level of risk. Because people going in with a collaborative mindset may overshare valuable information
Mm.
that is then used against them by a counterpart that had a very different agenda.
Yeah.
And that's where the preparation comes in. You've got to know your counterparty. You've got to know who you're actually negotiating with. You've got to know what history has demonstrated about their likelihood of integrity, ethics, behaving in a manner that's actually supportive of them showing you collaboration, not
Yeah.
telling you collaboration. If people show
Absolutely.
you who they are, I just want you to believe them the first time. Don't believe what they tell you, believe what they show you.
Absolutely. Because people don't do what they're told, they do what they see.
Yeah,
Because I
100%.
know that in the book you talk about, I think you sort of use the Thomas Kilmann instrument as a bit of a framework in terms of the different
Yeah,
negotiations types, and you threw in the Joker on top of that as well.
yeah,
Interestingly, we might go in with the best of intentions that we want to collaborate because we see this as a long-term win-win sort of relationship. But
yeah,
if you've got a competitor or if you've got somebody that's avoiding you or looking to compromise, you need to have the behavioral flexibility to say, okay, based on this situation, whilst I would like to collaborate and deliver value that's mutually beneficial, right now, where they're playing this game, I've got to meet them with where they're at, and we've got to try and get the best outcome based on the situation we find ourselves in and
yeah,
move forward that way. It's you
yeah.
just got to be open to that.
100%. And I think, with that framework, I talk about the sort of five different personalities and the axis they're sort of measured against is, the level of strength of relationship and the optimum result that people are seeking. And some people can over-index on the relationship. Often it's the accommodators that will accommodate the relationship but potentially compromise the result because they've
Mm,
over-accommodated. There's the people that avoid both. I'm not going to maximize the result, but I'm going to avoid the conflict too. And so therefore, I might think I'm saving the relationship, but I might also be harming it because I'm not leaning into the critical
mm,
conversations. So you've got the avoider. And sometimes the avoider character is personality profile is necessary, as is the accommodator is necessary. And to your point, you've got to know when it's necessary to put those personas, at the forefront to lead with. In a conflict situation, avoidance might be the appropriate thing to do in that moment because it's not the
yep.
time to pick the scab, right?
Mm,
So that might be necessary. But then you've got the dealer who's the halfway house, the concession giver, I'm not going to maximize the result on the actual outcome, but I'm also not going to damage the relationship, but I'm not going to make the relationship exceptional. It'll just be good. Everything will be good
mm,
enough. And then you've got the general who's, if you think from a military lens, the general's like, do as I say, we're going to have this, follow me. It's all about the outcome. And you might burn a few people in
yeah.
the relationship because you've been so dogmatic about the result, i.e.,
Mm,
you need to bring, your best value to the table, but I'm actually not going to give you anything. I just want to take as much as I can get. So you have people focus on the result, but often harm the relationship if it's long term. But if it's a short term relationship, it might not be appropriate to
mm,
make those concessions because in a short term interaction, you've got to think about what's appropriate for me to get the outcome that's needed if there's no long term relationship or dependency on this relationship. And then you have the hardest one, which is the diplomat. And everyone thinks they're a diplomat. And I love how everyone thinks they're a diplomat until they're put under pressure. And then you see them either fall very quickly into the accommodator or the general. And the diplomat is the hardest because the diplomat maximizes the relationship, but also maximizes the value. And that requires both will and skill. And a lot
Yeah.
of people lack one, either, or both of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah. And that's it's hard, and that's why you need to be prepared. That's why you need to put yourself in positions where you practice over and over again and learn from it, because you'll
Yeah.
learn a lot from how people react or respond in certain situations.
Yeah.
Love it, love it. So let's talk then about the actual methodology you've developed across your career called the Value Method.
Yeah.
It is an acronym, and without giving too much away, because we do want people to get access to the book and read it because it's filled with great information. Can you just give us a bit of an overview in terms of the Value Method and some of the key elements that we as negotiators should be focusing on to get the best outcome?
Yeah, I'll share the high level overview of the value method. The first step being V, it's all about value. You've got to
Mm,
identify it, identify your value, identify their value, identify the value available in the negotiation in the first instance. Because unless you know why you're sitting across from the other party to have a conversation to reach agreement in the first place, and you're not going to know what you're looking for. So you have to understand where value sits before that conversation is had. The second
So
step,
just on
yeah,
that
go
one,
on.
can I just ask?
Yeah.
Because within that I hear things like you've got to know your best case scenario, you've got to know your walkaway position. So a lot of people would have heard things like the zone of possible agreement. Is this the place where you've got to think about, okay, what does value look like for us? What's your position, or is it something different?
Not quite, not at that stage. I just think in the first instance, so you want to understand where is there opportunity for a deal? Like, why do we even want to have this conversation? What do I have to bring? What does the other party have to bring? And what are they caring about most? That's going to be the biggest friction point.
Hmm.
What do we care about the most? That's going to be the biggest friction point. But where might we have opportunity, that things we can give them that are low cost but high value, and things that we want that are high value in return but also cost us very little to give. So
Yeah.
it's really looking at value more holistically, and it's also looking at, like, at an individual level, what do we value, but also at a company level, what are our values,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So if we think about a company lens, we've got businesses that espouse values all the time. They put them on walls, they put them on brochures, they put them on team jerseys, or wherever else they might have them displayed. But I'd ask yourself, is the way you're going to show up in the relationship epitomizing your values?
Yeah.
Because if you say, we work together, or we act with care, and then you treat people badly, and you're the most difficult party to ever work with, like, you're not actually honoring who you say you are. So, like,
Mm.
match who you say you are with what you do, and that's where the becoming part comes in. Like, really make sure that your inside matches your outside.
Hmm.
So value there. But I'd also say, when you're thinking about your break points and where you can go to, that's later on when you're thinking about the data. So, like, you're looking at analyze the data. What data sources do we have? And often the data, need two sources. It's published data sources or people data sources. It's not complex. So who can you access information from that will give you context to understand what someone might be willing to say yes to, or what they will definitely
Mm.
say no to? Um, what published sources and reference points give you an understanding of where either the market's sitting, where there's a need, because it might not just be market pricing. It might be like, oh gosh, like, this business is trying to achieve this strategically, and we've got this capability that actually helps them deliver that strategic objective. So look for the data that's going to support demonstration of the value you have to give, but also the value you're seeking to receive from them. And so analyzing the data is step two. And then step three is all about leverage, because you have to understand your power. If
Mm.
you don't understand, one, where the power balance sits, and if someone thinks they're more powerful than you, expect them to play a more competitive strategy. However, if they think power is more equal, they're more likely to play a collaborative strategy. So you have
Yeah.
to understand, what does someone see their power balance as? And if you both think that you've got power over each other, expect the opportunity for value to be destroyed, because there's an option for egos to get in the way. So we need to
It'll be a
understand
pissing
that.
contest.
And it can be. I've seen plenty of examples where, yeah, value's destroyed because we both thought we had more power than each other, and everyone's played the most potent card, and you've ended up destroying value because it's combative rather than
Yeah,
collaborative. And
yeah,
so leverage plays a key point, and leverage comes from seeing it as a tool. What have you got that will actually encourage someone to reach an agreement? And it might be, for example, you've got time on your hands. So if someone's got urgency and you've got time, it gives you more leverage because you can scour the market for either a better supplier or a customer or vendor. And if they haven't got that time, then you've got more leverage. If you've got access to specific information that they don't have access to, you've got key IP, intellectual property that makes what you offer super valuable. Like all of these factors can give you leverage. But again, do many people sit down and go, where might we have leverage? What could we have that could be interesting and valuable to the other party? How could we use this more appropriately? Is our team capable? Do we have team leverage? Do people know what they're doing? Are we infighting so much that we destroy value in our own business before we go and get it externally?
yeah.
Lots of ways. So leverage is key. Then, and what I talk about in the book is often like power over versus power with, and like the force versus power.
Yeah.
Most people think they're using power, but they're actually using force.
Mm.
Force is very harmful to the other party, whereas power used wisely and compassionately actually uplifts everyone.
Which is
Um,
true leverage, really. It's true.
yeah,
So you
that's
don't
true
want to be,
leverage.
and you don't
Yeah,
want to be combative because you are creating that conditioning that you're a difficult person to deal with. So the next time they're going to be more prepared to deal
yeah.
with that. And guess what? They'll start projecting that, and you'll start becoming more like that.
Exactly right. And
Yeah.
then the uncomfortable piece, so that's the U in the acronym. You got to embrace feeling uncomfortable. You got to embrace being uncomfortable because if by nature you are comfortable, you're not asking for enough
Mm.
because you're playing small, you're playing within your realms of your minimum requirements rather than potentially the maximum available that other party has to give you.
Yeah.
The other thing around what's uncomfortable is your tone, your pace at which you speak, the language you use, the looseness of your language versus the conciseness of your language. I see it happen all the time. I do the same now. I put people under stressful simulated conditions. I film them. I show them what they actually do when they feel under pressure. Because I can't actually put the real high stakes in a
Oh,
simulated environment other than time videoing and showing them that they've got to think clearly under pressure. And you
I
see
didn't
the
realize
amount
I
of
had a tick.
yeah, yeah, I've got tick, and every time I make a proposal, I scratch the back of my neck, and I've got lots of tells that I didn't realize I had.
Yeah.
I've got language that I leak value through, and so I've really got to tighten up my language. And so there's lots of ways discomfort can show up, and one of them actually, and I'll share this with you because you are the exceptional sales leader, is that people fall into justification and
Yeah.
explaining their proposals after they've made a price position when they feel uncomfortable, which is actually justifying, explaining is a form of selling.
Mm.
Because in negotiation, you're not there to create the demand for your product and service. That's sales.
Mm.
Once it's established that there's demand and you're in a conversation around buying or selling, guess what? You're no longer selling, you're negotiating. And
Yes.
negotiating requires you to understand the distinction between sales, where you're creating demand, and negotiating where you're agreeing the terms. And what happens is when people feel uncomfortable, they'll put their price down and then they start selling their price and the benefits and all the things. And I'm like, oh, this makes me feel uncomfortable watching you because you're weakening your position. You do not need to weaken your position.
No.
With negotiation, we prime and position in advance so that when we put our price down, the perception of our value has already been influenced upwards, such that when we put our price down, we put our price down and stay silent.
Mm-hmm.
We zip it. No talking, we let it hang in the air, and we let other people lean into the discomfort of our silence, because we're embracing our discomfort
Yeah.
and our uncomfortableness, but we let other people sit with it, and then they start leaning in and selling and pitching and all the things that you don't want someone to do in a negotiation, but gives you really lots of valuable information. So it's great. And then the last step is the E, which is all about execute the plan. And I talk about this being, well, the assumption is you have a plan. Because if you don't have a plan, you're not going to have much to execute other than, um, you know, your quick judgment, which I guarantee you will not be very effective versus those that have actually spent time planning and executing. Because as I said, negotiation doesn't happen at the table. It happens well before you're at the table. It happens when you've designed the deal, when you've set the table for the deal, when you've influenced and primed and positioned the other party, such that the deal that you agree at the table is one that you've already facilitated to happen by the nature of your setup.
Yeah.
And so I always say, with executing the plan, there's 3 phases. It's what you do before, which is massive. It's 80 to 90% of where you should be focusing. Then what you do during, which is important, but over-indexed when you have to rely on that to be much better, your language to be concise, your body language to be more effective, your delivery to be more powerful. So much harder if you haven't done the setup, if you haven't done the pre-work, because you're having to now do everything in the room, in the moment. And then post negotiation, I mean, like whilst everyone's celebrating and giving themselves high five for getting to a yes, often they don't realize value is destroyed because nobody thought about thinking about the implementation and how we're going to measure it and who's doing what and how do we know and what's going to bring us back to the table, what's going to keep us away from renegotiating again. And if we did the planning up front, we'd condition all of that pre any contract signing so that then the contract signing stage doesn't take freaking forever. Because everyone's then having another negotiation about the implementation rather than, all of the preceding and stuff that we do in advance. So
Yeah, it's
yeah.
like, oh, we didn't consider that. Oh, and that's where you see some organizations probably giving too much away in the negotiation and not considering, well, how are we actually going to deliver this? In order for us to deliver what we've just agreed to, we're going to have to employ more people. We're going to have to put more finance into the deal, which means our
Correct.
profitability starts to
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
diluted even further.
Yeah.
I don't
So
do that.
that planning phase becomes really important.
Yeah,
And how you exchange value becomes really, really powerful. But you
yeah,
can do it in a really, collaborative way when appropriate. I wouldn't say go blindly into collaboration without first assessing your risk and your strategy. If you go into it without a risk assessment, you're being naive. So you have to understand the context that not everyone thinks.
yeah.
At a level of lifting the consciousness of humanity. A lot of people are very self-interested. So if you're
Oh,
dealing with
really?
if you're dealing with a self-interested person whose ego is driving, how they approach the negotiation, then you're going to have to take a more assertive,
Mm.
competitive approach, and that's appropriate. But it
And
doesn't
that's
mean, yeah,
And that's where you use, as you described, that's where you use your power, not your
yeah,
force.
yeah.
Although I'm sure there's sometimes a fine line between, hey, this person's not getting it. I'm just going to have to be forceful and say you're not getting this.
Yeah, I think if you've done the pre-work though, you know who you're up against.
Yeah,
So you already know how to influence them long before you get to the table.
yeah,
Like most people know, a sales director or a CEO or a finance CFO will have their go-to person who they listen to.
mm,
Who's their mentor, who's their trusted advisor, who are the people that they listen to. And then you look at who they are and go, okay, great, how do I influence them so that
yep,
when I want the decision maker to say, yes, I've already influenced the person they're going to ask
yep,
about this context, this situation. And if they're not the person, who else is the person that they lean to? And we're reverse mapping our stakeholders to
yes,
understand who we should actually start communicating with first, because often people go, let's go straight to the decision maker. I'm like, not always, because you want the decision maker to make the decision you want them to make, and how you
yes,
prime and influence that happens long before you have the phone call or the
100%.
face-to-face
Which
session.
is
Yeah.
which is all the power mapping, which we you would think is sales 101, negotiation 101, but it's amazing how many people don't consider that.
Do not do it. Do
No.
not do it, because everyone's chasing the tail. Everyone's
Yeah.
in the now. It's like, let's
Yeah.
get this done quickly. Let's see what they come back with, and then we'll plan our next move. I'm like, oh,
Yes.
okay,
So we're very
sure.
reactive rather than being proactive.
Yeah.
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 Hey,
like something.
really conscious of time because you've got a meeting to get to. So,
All good.
really love this conversation. So, as we sort of bring this to a close, and we're looking at back end of 2024 into 2025, is there a theme? Is there a sort of a not so much a catchphrase? Is an overarching theme that you're wanting people to walk away with that can hold them in good stead for negotiation, whether it's the big business to business negotiations or whether it's in fact negotiating internally for some resources or a pay increase? Is there an overarching principle that if we just held on to that and started to put more focus on it, it might give us some impetus and some momentum?
Yeah. Focus on who you want to be rather than what you need to know as a tactic or a, you know, or a method. Because and we often think about, it's like, there's a book written Who Not How, but that talks about, find the right who rather than trying to solve the how all the time. In
Yeah.
my context, it's the decide the who you want to be, and that will determine the how you show up
Hmm.
and the what you do. Because if you anchor your approach to your values and your identity, even in a competitive, combative situation, you will go high in behavior when the other party goes low.
Hmm.
And there is no amount of training that is going to change someone's behavior if they haven't considered their own identity level sort of traits.
Yeah.
Who are they being? What belief systems do they have? What value systems do they have? Because unless you address it at an identity level, we can do all the training in the world and you'll still have people that will ignore it, won't listen to it, act against it, go and do silly things. And it's like, cool, you do you, but you've clearly decided who you want to be. Like, I'm not here to, I'm not gonna change you if you don't want to be changed. Like,
That's
cool.
it.
But you
And the
decide
con
your identity. Like, my identity is someone who prides getting to a level of mastery and then consistently having the humility to say, I don't know everything. What else can I learn?
Yeah.
But that's who I am. But it
Love it.
drives how I show up in life, it drives how I show up in business, and it drives the value I create for the people that I work with. Yeah. And I think that's
Non-negotiable.
the biggest thing that negotiation has taught me is humility.
Yeah.
Because, those that are not demonstrating humility will never be able to de-escalate a difficult situation when there's egos and people needing to prove how amazingly awesome they are. I'm sure they are in the mirror.
I love that. What a good way to finish. And as you were talking, it reminded me, Jim Rohn popped into my head and he said, keep working harder on yourself than you do on your job, and you'll never arrive, but you'll
100%.
always be work in progress.
Yeah, exactly right. As my expertise in negotiations developed, from my very first formal training and then informal training, like we have informal training in life all the time,
Yeah.
I still recognize that there is more that I want to get better at. There's better ways of doing things. There's a better identity that I have to access through the development of this skill set. And that's,
100%.
I think that's what, if anyone, whether it's, an exceptional sales leader wanting to take it up a level, it's seeing themselves as the identity of, I want to be an exceptional sales leader. Therefore, I'm going to
Yeah.
choose to lean in to do the training that's necessary to make me exceptional and
Brilliant.
continue to build on my mastery. Yeah,
Yeah. Knowing that I'll never arrive, which is
exactly right. Never.
ever, ever. So, Glenn, hey, first of all, thank you for jumping on. It's been a phenomenal conversation. It's been over an hour. Um, so much gold you've
Thanks so
shared.
much.
I think for anybody that's listening to this, if you don't take at least one or two things away from this, then you haven't paid attention. So go back and listen to this again. The other thing I want you to do is go and get hold of Glenn's book as well. So, Glenn, for people that want to connect with you, learn more about what you do, and particularly get hold of the book, The Negotiation Playbook, where is the best place for them to do
Come
so?
and find me on LinkedIn. Yeah, so Glin Bayley, Bayley with a Y, Bayley. Find me on LinkedIn. There'll be a link to buy my book, The Negotiation Playbook. You can also find it on Amazon. It's currently in stores in and around Australia. I think it's just launching in the US and in Europe in this next month. So it will be available globally. And I'd say, yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn, and then you can access my website. And if you want a conversation, I'm here for it.
Brilliant. Awesome. Well, may I thank you on a Monday? I know you're about to get to another meeting, so you've got some preparation time, but I just want to thank you for being a guest on the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast. Absolutely love the conversation.
Thanks, Darren. Much appreciated. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for being such a great host.
All the best. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast. I trust the information in this episode has been helpful in your journey towards becoming exceptional. And remember, please take the time to rate the show, subscribe to the show so other people can find it. But also, if I can help you, jump on my calendar, go to leadwithdarren.com, and let's have a conversation about how I can help you along your journey to being exceptional.